It is 7:08, and this morning Pope Leo has responded after President Donald Trump lambasted the pontiff. Pope Leo telling reporters that he does not fear the Trump administration and that he will not enter into a debate. Pope Leo has been an outspoken critic of the U.S. and Israeli war with Iran, and President Trump said Sunday night that he is not a big fan of the first American to lead the Roman Catholic Church.